All right, this topic usually draws a large crowd, so it's good to see you all on today. The topic is vitamin D and cancer survival, and can vitamin D reduce cancer mortality or cancer-induced death? And this is a topic that draws a crowd because cancer is the number 2 killer in the United States behind cardiovascular disease, but is gaining on cardiovascular disease every year. And so we're all looking for the best strategies to prevent its occurrence and or survive it if it does come. And so we've got a brand new study hot off the press from June 2023 here, from many great minds ranging from Harvard to Massachusetts General Hospital to Ohio State University to a bunch of foreign colleges and clinics that all collaborated to put this study together. And the study is entitled Efficacy of Vitamin D3 Supplementation on Cancer Mortality. And the study is a systemic review and individual patient data meta-analysis of randomized clinical trials. And that's a mouthful, but what you need to understand is a systematic review and meta-analyses are very rigorous ways to study multiple individual studies. So what they did is they took multiple randomized clinical trials, or randomized controlled trials that looked at vitamin D and cancer, and they combine all those studies and do a rigorous statistical analysis to say what can we pull out of all of these studies combined. Okay, and what we'll see is a significant question out of this combination is, could colon cancer and prostate cancer patients specifically be missing out if they are not using vitamin D? And this can also apply to a broad range of cancers, but you'll see that the statistics really support colon and prostate as we dive in. So let's jump over to the study, because there are a ton of nuggets in this study, and we're going to invest some time reading through it on this call, but it's worth the time because of what it reveals for us. And it reveals information that actually you can use, today. You can implement it into your life, not just hear a cool clinical nugget that doesn't apply to anything. So let's jump over there. And here we are in the PDF of the study, and the study is open access. So this is a public paper that you could plug in the title or go on pubmed.gov and download yourself and read through thoroughly. And I encourage you to do that. But again, the title is Efficacy of Vitamin D3 Supplementation on Cancer Mortality. Now, this is important for multiple reasons. The first of which is that vitamin D is widely available. Second of which, vitamin D is massively, massively inexpensive, especially relative to the cost of chemotherapy and radiation and surgery. And it's very easy to do. And so if we can find a strategy that covers all those bases, then it's a no-brainer. And this doesn't mean that it replaces the chemo, radiation, and or surgery, but it should definitely be adjunctive if it passes the test scientifically. So, like I said, we're going to invest some time reading about this because it's very important and illuminating for us. So again, we said that this paper looked at multiple randomized controlled trials and extracted the data from that. And one benefit of being able to combine all those studies is that you have a larger sample size of patients that were studied. And so instead of looking at one study that maybe looked at 10,000 patients, this study combined a bunch of studies, 14 different studies, for a total of almost 105,000 patients. So that is very important, because you can, the higher the numbers you have, the more statistical significance you can find in the data. So let's dive into the meat. First, again, why does cancer matter, or why does the study matter? Well, because even though we've had a 50-year war on cancer, quote unquote, there's been no wins. Okay, cancer is still the #1 killer, gaining as the number 2 killer, gaining as the #1 killer. And all the research and money they've thrown at it from a pharmaceutical standpoint has been for naught, because we've made no gains essentially. As an example, 2020, there were 19.3 million new cancer cases and approximately 10 million cancer deaths worldwide. The number of new cancer diagnoses is growing due to an aging population and changing risk factors, and is projected to reach 30 million new cases by 2040. Vitamin D deficiency is prevalent worldwide and more common in cancer patients during cancer therapy than in the general population. In red here, the prevalence of vitamin D deficiency, which is defined as a 25-hydroxy vitamin D level less than 30, is representative in representative population samples from the United States and Europe has been reportedly 6% and 13% respectively. So I highlighted that in red because this paper defines vitamin D deficiency as less than 30 nanomoles per liter. Okay, so if you're looking at your labs, you can look at the normal range, and if the normal range says anything less than 30 falls in normal range, that is not correct based on the science. Okay, and there are some labs that will tell you 25 is in normal range, and that's just not true. And even if you have a 31, even that's technically in normal range, but that's not a good number either. These numbers that say 6% of the US population is vitamin D deficient by this definition, I would be interested to test the whole US population, because I bet the numbers are worse than that based on my clinical experience. Low vitamin D levels were strongly associated with poorer cancer survival in previous cancer studies. Well, how would vitamin D play a role in cancer prevention and cancer survival? So if you look at the blue, from a biological perspective, it is plausible that a sufficient vitamin D status has an impact on cancer prognosis by binding to the vitamin D receptor. The active hormone 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D influences signaling pathways that regulate cell proliferation, differentiation, and cell survival, and thus acts as an anti-proliferative agent in many tissues and can slow the growth of malignant cells. So what all that says is vitamin D binds the vitamin D receptor, and through that mechanism, it controls the rate of cell proliferation, or how quickly they expand, how long they survive, and how they differentiate. And tumor cells have vitamin D receptors. So if we can use vitamin D to slow down how quickly a tumor cell spreads, that is beneficial for the patient, right? And for our chances of eliminating the cancer. Animal experiments have shown that 125 vitamin D delays age-related changes via vitamin D receptor mediated activation of the NRF2 pathway. And the NRF2 pathway is a major antioxidant pathway, which inhibits oxidative stress and DNA damage, which are both relevant in driving tumors and cancer. So meta-analyses of observational studies report elevated risks of lung cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer, bladder cancer, and lymphoma in people with low vitamin D. Sufficient levels, so again in red here, this study defines sufficient levels of vitamin D as greater than 50. Okay, so again, if we're talking about lab ranges here, if you go look at your lab, the range for vitamin D for the 25-hydroxy vitamin D, okay, low and high, you'll see that the low end is anything below 30 and the high end is anything above 100. So if you're anywhere between these two, they'll call you have normal vitamin D level, and your doctor will say you're fine. But this study is saying anything below 50 here is insufficient. Okay, so sufficiency is 50 plus. And so if you have a 38, you're still insufficient. If you have a 49, you're still insufficient. We want 50 or higher. And this is corroborated by other studies relevant to COVID that found and suggested that if our population had had a vitamin D level of 50 or greater, we would have had 0 severe cases, because vitamin D is a powerful antiviral as well. So depending on, or no matter whether you're studying cancer or viruses or whatever impact you want from vitamin D, many of these studies are saying we want 50 plus. Okay, so that's the first goal you want to shoot for. And sufficient vitamin D levels greater than 50 are associated with better prognosis in patients with breast and colon cancer. So again, if you fear breast cancer or colon cancer, or you have either of those, you want to get your D tested and get that level above 50 as soon as possible. Moving on, low vitamin D levels were substantially related to increased cancer mortality in the general population. So again, low D, higher death from cancer. Mendelian randomization studies found a causal relationship between low vitamin D and cancer mortality. So Mendelian randomization studies is a different methodology that it helps more strongly understand relationships, from correlation to causation. Okay, so is it correlated or is it causal? Well, the Mendelian randomization study supported a causal relationship between low D and cancer. So it's not like, hey, we found low D in patients with cancer. Isn't that interesting? These studies support that the low D causes cancer death. Okay, not having enough D causes cancer death in those studies found. So the point of this study was to evaluate the effect of vitamin D supplementation on cancer mortality in the general population and to evaluate the effect of vitamin D supplementation on prognosis in cancer patients. So why does this matter? Again, because we can supplement with vitamin D. It's easy, it's fast, it's cheap, okay, and it's safe. So they looked at, does vitamin D dose? Does the regimen, so do you take it daily or do you take it in one giant dose and then once a week, and how long do you take it? All of those factors are what they want to look at and determine, do they matter, which is very important because there are a lot of different ways to take it and dose it, etc. So in the study, trials that use, so how did they select the studies to study? Trials that use vitamin D3 and its equivalent substances in any dose and any regimen, whether it was daily, weekly, or monthly, for at least 6 months, were included. Okay, so if they dosed vitamin D3 for less than 6 months, that test didn't count. They wanted to see at least 6 months taking it or more. And then they excluded studies that were only looking at vitamin D3 that was supplied by fortified foods or vitamin D2. Now, this is really important because I've had many patients that have low vitamin D as found by their medical doctor on the test. And so the medical doctor will give them 50,000 units of vitamin D2 once a week. And what this says right here is that vitamin D2 or any of its equivalents were eliminated or not studied because it has already been found that D2 does not affect mortality, cancer mortality. Okay, since 2014, they've known that. And there's also papers out there that suggest vitamin D2 increases mortality. So vitamin D2 is not what you want. And too often medical doctors use that form. That is not the form you want. You want vitamin D3. So pay attention to what you're being given and only take the D3. And whether or not the 50,000 units once a week is good, we'll get to in a little bit. Moving on here. We'll talk about that in a little bit. All right, so cancer mortality in the general population. We'll talk about that later. All right, so here we go about the dosing with vitamin D. Our results show efficacy of daily dosing with vitamin D, not bolus dosing. Okay, what's the difference? Daily dosing is exactly what it says. You take a daily dose of a lower number, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, whatever, versus a bolus dose would be that medical doctor giving you 50,000 units one day, once a week, right? So they're loading you up with this massive dose and then you don't take any the rest of the week, versus daily dosing, you're taking a daily amount. So our results show efficacy of daily dosing, not bolus dosing, vitamin D supplementation in reducing cancer mortality. And this is consistent with previous meta-analyses on cancer mortality or all-cause mortality. So whether we're talking about your risk of death from cancer or your risk of death from any cause, this study and previous studies find that daily dosing is the way to go, not bolus dosing. Why? Well, because there's enzymes that convert vitamin D to the form you need it in the body to do its job. Okay, so when you give daily doses, those daily doses that aren't huge, massive bolus doses, they promote the optimal conversion of the 25-hydroxy-D, which is the form your supplement is in, to be converted to the 125 form, which is the active form that binds the vitamin D receptor and has the anti-cancer effects. So the daily doses allow you to do that. Whereas intermittent, so say once a week, non-physiologically large vitamin D bolus doses, so 50,000 IU doses once a week, they lead to unstable cycling of the 25 to 125 levels in the blood. In the long run, the bolus doses at a weekly or larger interval lead to an upregulation of the opposing enzymes, which ultimately leads to lower synthesis and or higher degradation of vitamin D. So the bolus dose, they're trying to give you a 50,000 unit dose to get your level up. And what that ends up doing is actually lowering your D because it overloads, it stimulates the enzymes that oppose vitamin D conversion. So in red here, bolus dose, unlike daily doses, also failed to reduce C-reactive protein response. So why is that important? Well, C-reactive protein is one of the systemic inflammatory markers that all doctors use to understand your level of inflammation, specifically systemic inflammation. So if the bolus dose doesn't reduce CRP, you're taking it to try and reduce inflammation and it doesn't do that. Whereas the daily dose does, okay? The bolus dose, unlike the daily dose, does not reduce CRP and actually elevated anti-inflammatory cytokines and doubled the risk of high calcium in the blood. So you don't want to have high calcium in the blood, and you don't want to elevate certain cytokines that would allow for cancer to progress. So you don't want bolus doses, okay? You want the daily dose. A consistent long-term lower dose is much better, as this is showing, than an intermittent high dose. So timing of cancer diagnosis and initiation of vitamin D supplementation. So when should you start vitamin D? Okay. So it is important that vitamin D3 treatment is initiated early, ideally before cancer diagnosis. So when should you start it? Today. If you're not taking vitamin D, you should start today, especially if you're concerned with cancer and your survival of cancer if you were to be diagnosed. So start it right away. The most relevant times for cancer survival in terms of supplementing are before diagnosis, because this is relevant for the stage of cancer detection, and during cancer therapy, since this time decides on the efficacy and tolerance of the cancer therapy. It is plausible that taking vitamin D3 in these times is most relevant because D3 has been shown to be anti-proliferative and anti-inflammatory in cancer patients. The former mechanism, so the anti-proliferative mechanism, can reduce tumor size before diagnosis, and the latter can improve cancer treatment tolerance. Okay, so essentially you want to start right away. That it's best to have your vitamin D levels up before diagnosis for the best outcome. And as this says, it could reduce tumor size before the diagnosis and, maybe prevent you from ever being diagnosed. Cancer stage. The overall association between vitamin D3 supplementation and cancer stage is biologically plausible, as the vitamin D receptor is also present in malignant cells, enabling D3 to slow tumor progression by promoting cell differentiation and inhibiting metastasis. There's epidemiological evidence that late stages of colon cancer are associated with vitamin D deficiency. Okay, so if if you have a family history of colon cancer, getting your vitamin D up may be protective for you. It should be noted that the overall prostate cancer and colon cancer survival narrowly missed statistical significance. So it's right on the borderline of being beneficial. And they go through and say, basically, we believe there's a beneficial role of D3 supplementation for colon cancer patients. Strength of your D dose. Now here's where, we'll get into it. So for daily dosing regimens and cancer mortality, we observe no efficacy differences between low doses, so less than 1,000 a day, and average doses of 1 to 2,000 a day. The point estimate of hazard ratio was lower at higher doses, so greater than 2,000 a day, but the confidence interval is wide. It would be of interest to see future studies using a dose of 2,000 or higher targeted to participants with initial vitamin D deficiency. So basically, all of the doses studies are too low, and these are considered in research as, maybe higher doses, or by medical doctors as higher doses, because the RDA for recommended daily allowance for vitamin D is 400 IUs, but that RDA is pitifully low. And that was even revealed in COVID, where Britain paid for the elderly. They paid for their vitamin D supplements to get their vitamin D up. It was too little too late, but they realized, hey, 400 isn't enough. We need these people to be taking at least 2,000 a day. But in reality, there's multiple studies out there that say 2,000 a day is way too low. And it suggests that the average adult should be taking 4,000 to 6,000 IU a day. So I suspect that if these studies were done with 4,000 to 6,000 and maybe even higher into the 10,000 range, we'd probably see even better efficacy for cancer mortality. Hopefully those studies will be done in the future and we won't have to theorize. We can have that data. So in conclusion, you made it. Thanks for sticking with me, and hopefully this has helped you out. But in conclusion, what did they find? We believe that the arguments for an efficacy of daily vitamin D treatment regimens are convincing. When they really dug into the statistics, they found that daily dosing yielded a statistically significant 13% cancer mortality reduction. So 13% reduced risk of death from cancer, and an 11% increased cancer-specific survival. So it reduced your risk of death from cancer 13%, increased your survival 11%. As these effect estimates are based on untargeted vitamin D3 supplementation of individuals with and without D insufficiency, the potential in a situation where only patients with low vitamin D status are treated is likely to be substantially underestimated. So what that means is these studies had patients that had vitamin D deficiency, insufficiency, and sufficiency. So it's a mix of people with various vitamin D levels. What they said here is if they studied only vitamin D deficient patients, the benefits on cancer mortality and on cancer survival would likely be higher. So they'd like to, divide the studies up into just low vitamin D compared to sufficient vitamin D. Furthermore, our findings suggest that for the health outcome of cancer survival, starting vitamin D3 treatment before or at least shortly after a cancer diagnosis could be beneficial. Right, so start today is basically what they're saying. It's never too early to start your vitamin D supplementation. And then lastly, here in red, considering the very likely underestimation of vitamin D3 effects in the currently available trials by not focusing on subjects with low vitamin D only and allowing vitamin D self-medication in the control group, the almost negligible risk of adverse events from vitamin D supplementation at reasonable doses and very low treatment costs, we believe that vitamin D is an underutilized medication for cancer patients and should be considered for use in addition to the primary cancer therapy. Okay, so it's a big paragraph saying because of this, and this reason, we believe that vitamin D is underutilized. Okay, and again, like we started out, it's easy, it's very inexpensive, and it's not dangerous at all. Okay, so they end with vitamin D is an underutilized medication for cancer patients and should be considered for use in addition to primary cancer therapy, especially when low vitamin D levels justify its use. Okay, so I stopped the highlight because I think based on what I know about vitamin D, I think it should be used in everybody. These guys are concerned mostly with the people with low vitamin D, and the effect in people with low vitamin D would likely be greater than the effect of people with sufficient vitamin D. But again, vitamin D has benefits beyond just cancer. So everyone wants to have sufficient vitamin D levels for global health. So let's open this up for questions.
Yeah, I have a question.
Mhm.
So this is looking on people mainly who have cancer and their survival rate.
Mhm.
Can we infer from this that vitamin D supplementation can help or possibly prevent cancer?
Yes, I think so. Because of this mechanism here, right? The vitamin D binds the vitamin D receptor and regulates proliferation, differentiation, and cell survival. Okay, so tumor cells proliferate or reproduce too quickly. Okay, so that's one of their characteristics. Tumor cells they don't undergo apoptosis well. So apoptosis is programmed cell death. So all of our cells have a programmed cell death. Hey, you're allowed, like a red blood cell, you're allowed to live for 120 days, and then you're done. So our cells have, say, clocks that you're allowed to live this long, and then you're going to be gotten rid of and recycled. Well, tumor cells don't undergo that, so they shut off that programmed cell death so they can live longer. So that's not correct. But vitamin D helps with that, and then differentiation. If they differentiate, into cells they shouldn't be, like a metastatic cell or tumor cell that can proliferate better and shut off its apoptosis, then you're in trouble. That can be malignant. So yes, I think we can infer based on this data that if we have sufficient vitamin D and it's binding the vitamin D receptor and regulating these pathways properly, there's a lower likelihood that a tumor cell sneaks by.
I have a question that's different. Does vitamin D need to be coupled with is it K2? I mean, there's some, if you go look in the store, there's some that are coupled, and there are some that aren't. Is there a benefit or a need for it to be coupled with something, or is just the vitamin D3 good on its own?
It doesn't need to be. It depends on what your goal is. So vitamin D, E, K, and A are the fat soluble vitamins, and so they're best absorbed, in the context of fat, and they do have relationships to each other. So it is for general health, it is important to have them in proper relationships, and so that's where taking a D and a K2 can be beneficial. But if we're talking about dosing D to the levels that we want to replete D status, those vitamin D K2 supplements, a lot of times, the D's too low in them, or you may be taking more K2 than you want to take to get the D level you want. Does that make sense? So the D supplement by itself allows you to address the D by itself. If there's a patient in front of me that has D issues and K2 issues, then we could use both, but it just depends on what we're trying to do.
Okay, and you should always get the oil kind, right? Because it is fat soluble.
I'm biased towards that. Yeah, I mean capsules work too, because before there was oil versions, there were capsule versions and tablet versions, but yeah, I mean the oil is more quickly, and I suspect better absorbed.
Thank you.
Hey, I had a question on the large dosing versus daily dosing. What if it was low, you did a large dose and then daily dosing to maintain it? Does that happen?
It does probably. I think that you know, the issue there is if you do the large dose and that has the impact on the enzymes that drives the opposing enzymes, then, you know, the following doses may not be as effective as you want in the short term. And so rather than mess with that enzyme game, you can take high doses daily to get it up that are not so high that they're bolus doses. So for example, the medical doctor will give you $50,000 or 50,000 IUs once a week. Whereas, you know, you could get a better effect by taking 10,000 a day for a week. You know, so ultimately over the week you actually took in 70,000, but you took it at a pace that was not overloading the physiology.
And then like back down later.
Right. Yeah. So
Okay, that makes sense.
So that's not a recommendation for anyone listening to this. That's just an example of what could be done, you know, with your doctor
Right.
who knows your case. Yeah.
And how often should, if let's say you're insufficient or deficient, how often, and you're taking the increased daily dose, how often should you be tested to find your personal, you know, daily dose to keep you above 50 and below 100?
I use 6-week increments. So I mean, you could do it shorter, I guess. But in my practice, at least I use 6-week increments, and we that's usually sufficient.
Yeah, because
So if
probably not a lot of, you know, general doctors will not want to do it that
oh yeah, they
quickly.
won't. I mean, a lot of
It's
them
like,
won't want to run your D at all. So
right, or do it once a year, and
Yeah.
that's not helpful.
yeah. So yeah, the likelihood is you'd have to find a alternative quack doctor like myself who will run it, you know, every 6 weeks or in 6-week intervals to figure out, can we get you where we want you to go? Or if you don't have a functional medicine doctor that you work with, you know, you could pay out of pocket to any lab test now or these other consumer lab companies to just order it on yourself.
I have a question that kind of goes along with that, but it's not specific to cancer. Does vitamin D play a role in cardiovascular risk? Does it help lower cardiovascular risk, or does it help at all with cardiovascular risk?
Oh yeah. Yeah. So if we go, I'll just show you one mechanism here. Where was that? Red line at the bottom of the page. There it is. So right here, when we were talking about, does it lower C-reactive protein or not? Okay. C-reactive protein is medicine's favorite inflammatory marker. Okay. Why? Because this marker by itself is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So if this is high, so basically the normal range is 0 to 3 for a high sensitivity C-reactive protein. And so if you're between 0 and 1, 1 and 2, 2 and 3, I'm doing this wrong. Actually, hold on. Yeah, it's this way. So 0, 1, yeah, I was doing it right. My bad. And then 3 plus. Okay, so 0 to 1 is optimal. 1 to 2 is low. 2 to 3 is average. And 3 plus is high. High what? So these are the relative risk of cardiovascular disease based on this marker. Okay, so this is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease risk. If you're greater than 3, that puts you in the highest relative risk category for cardiovascular disease. Versus if your result is between 1 and 2, you're in the low risk. 2 to 3 would be average. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So vitamin D3 is known. D3 is known to lower C-reactive protein, which lowers your cardiovascular risk. So if you were a say your HSCRP was 4 and you lowered it to 1.5, you just lowered your cardiovascular disease risk from high to low per that marker, right?
Okay.
So it's one part of the puzzle. Of course, if you have a normal CRP but you smoke, doesn't mean you have no cardiovascular risk, right? Just means through that variable you have low risk.
Yeah. And mine was on the low side, but we got it even lower. I
Mhm.
do have other markers, the apoprotein
Yeah.
that you talked about. I do have high that, but it's interesting. I just wanted to know the correlation because I am taking D3 every day.
Yeah.
Per your
Yeah.
recommendation.
So, yes, good. Thank you. And the question is great overall because it just reinforces that, and we said this in the ApoB video too, there's more than one factor to cardiovascular disease risk. So if your ApoB is optimal, right, that's the best lipid or lipoprotein marker for cardiovascular disease risk. So if your ApoB is optimal, that's great. But if your CRP is at 10 at the same time, you're at low risk from the ApoB standpoint, but you're at high risk from the CRP standpoint, right? So
Right.
it's like, what is the overall context of the case in terms of risk factors? We can't hang our hat on just one,
Right.
whether good or bad, right?
Yeah.
Or you might have great ApoB and normal CRP, but you smoke and you hate your job, so that, and you feel alone socially, like those could cause a heart attack, even though physiologically you were fine. So it's a whole picture.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
One more question to add to all these. Is it advisable to continue in summer as well? Because we are out a lot. I mean, we
Mhm.
talked about swimming pool.
Yep. Yeah. So that's a great question, Niraj, and that's to be answered individually as well. So like if we tested Sue's vitamin D in January, right, and it was low, or no, let's go back. We don't have to go that far back. Let's see, we're in June 19th. So let's say we tested her in early May, like May 1st, and her D was insufficient. So we said, hey, you should take some vitamin D, up your dose, do it for 6 weeks, let's retest. And we got our labs back today and it's improved, but not where we want it yet. Then yes, continue to take it through summer. Right. Or Niraj, you've got more melanin in your skin, you've got a darker skin tone. People with darker skin have poorer absorption of vitamin D. So you may need to take it all year round. So it's really about, hey, what's your vitamin D level right now? Because you might go into summer and have normal D and then get in a car accident or have something happen that increases your systemic inflammation. Well, vitamin D is a big time anti-inflammatory. So if you're having to use that vitamin D fire extinguisher to put out that new fire, you lowered your level, right? Well, that's great. You had the margin there to use on the inflammatory trigger, but now you've got to get that D back up. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So basically keep testing and keep modifying accordingly.
Yeah. So it's like, where's the person at right now?
Yeah.
And there's data out there that suggests unless you're naked 24/7 at the equator, you're really not going to get enough vitamin D from the sun to get your level where you want it to be. The higher you go in latitude, the lower the angle of incidence from the sun, so the poorer the absorption of vitamin D. And that's one association they found in multiple sclerosis patients is the further north you go, the lower the vitamin D levels and the higher the incidence of MS. So it's just one relationship out there that, and what they figured out, like what's driving that relationship was, hey, the angle of the sun and how it's hitting the earth, and it's less well absorbed up north.
And I have found through multiple decades of getting my vitamin D tested at, different times of the year, that my maintenance dose in the summer is 5,000 IUs, but in winter I go up to 6,000 because it just creeps down a little because I'm not out in the sun. And then when I am in the sun, I just knock down the vitamin D supplement because I am in the sun. So it's just whatever your personal range is to keep you in that sweet spot.
Well, and here's another, if you want to look at the screen, we've talked about in the past, sunlight, right? And time of day that we should be in the sun, and should we use sunscreen and all of this. And so if this is the arc of the sun, hold on, let me do it better for you. So we use yellow as the arc of the sun, and we use black as time of day, and we have call this like 10 a.m. and call this 4 p.m. Okay, so you could call this like 1 p.m. All right, so there's research, and we've made a video on this. It's been a year or two now, but you could go back and find it, where the research says the lower the sun is on the horizon, whether it's early day or late evening, right? That's the more near infrared light you're getting. And the near infrared light early in the day is preparatory, or preparing you, protective. And the near infrared light at the end of the day is reparatory. I don't know if that's a real word, but it's repairing. Okay. So you want to get the sun in these times, and these would be the times where the vitamin D is going to be helpful for you. If you get the vitamin D in these times, this is where the sun is straight down on you, and this is the high UV light from the sun. And that is the pro-cancer, high oxidative stress, DNA damaging. That's the unhealthy sunlight that we don't want. And so, people might be like, and when do people go to the beach? They go to the beach from like 11 to 4, right? In this bad time. So they go and get scorched, and they're like, I'm getting plenty of vitamin D. I could lower my vitamin D over the summer. And it's like, well, no, you probably just lowered it by being out in the sun like that, because it drove so much oxidative stress that you're having to use your vitamin D to trigger that nerve pathway to have the antioxidant effect to protect you from driving, skin cancer, say. So if you think you're getting good D because you're in the sun at noon, you're actually maybe not. Okay, the good sun would be in these early times, so leading up to say 10 or after 4. So sunrise to sunset. And where I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, actually, 10 a.m. or the 10 a.m. time is probably bad sun. And so how do you tell? Well, the easy trick is to look at your shadow. So if this is me, okay, and if the sun is early morning, then my shadow is going to be taller than me, and I'll be safe. If it's coming down here at noontime, my shadow's very small and I'm dangerous. If it's coming in at nighttime, my shadow is tall. Okay. So the sun is safe when your shadow is taller than you. That's the easiest way to figure it out versus just looking at your clock. So when I go to the pool, I just look at my shadow. Or if I'm going to sit out on my deck and eat breakfast, I just look at my shadow to determine, do I want to take my shirt off or not? So that's an easy kind of hack for you to figure out, am I getting good, healthy, vitamin D sun, or am I getting potentially toxic sunburning, potentially skin cancerous sun?
Oh, that's wonderful. That's very, very useful. Thank you.
Uh-huh.